Member Paul Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity to speak on this bill, the Resource Management Restricted Duration of Certain Discharge and Coastal Permits Amendment Bill for the second reading. And I'm afraid to say I find this rather a strange bill because it purports to reduce the effect on the Taurarira River, but of course it wouldn't have any impact for at least 22 years because it's not retrospective, and so and the Tasman Mills have got a 25-year consent only recently, and so for 22 years a lot of the submitters that we heard in the Select Committee who seem to think that if this bill was passed something substantial would change within 5 years were confused, and so this bill sets out to do something in 22 years. Now, the other thing is that ultimately the Select Committee was convinced that it was trying to provide a solution to a problem that doesn't really exist, given the utility of Section 102 Section 107 brackets 2 already in the Resource Management Act, and so the advice we were given was certainly that that a 5-year limit on consents granted under Section 102 would not provide sufficient time for investment certainty for businesses, especially in a situation where technology to reduce the pollution further does not yet exist, such as in the Tasman Mill. And so the advice we received was that the current ability of the Environmental Court to assess each consent on its merits and tailor the consent solutions accordingly is more flexible and fit for purpose than an arbitrary 5-year limit. And so it was interesting hearing some of the submissions, and one of them was from Contact Energy, and the committee was intrigued and very concerned because this bill doesn't just relate to the Taurarira River and the Tasman Mills, it would apply right throughout the country. And so we were interested that Contact Energy had relied on this provision 107.2 in the consent of Wairaki geothermal power developments, and we asked them what would they have done if they had not been able to use Section 107 brackets 2, and their reply was very very illuminating. They said, well, they only really had two other options. One was greater discharge into the Waikato River. This is through as a result of their geothermal power generation, and given the environmental policy of reducing those discharges, that would have been difficult to achieve and not really an option. So the only other practice was to increase its level of planned re-injection into the field. But the problem with that is that it would have put the reservoir at risk of premature cooling because of the likely returns of cooler injectate intersecting hot production fluid before the injectate had travelled a sufficient distance through the hot rock to reheat it. The net effect, and I won't go into the geothermal details of it, but the net effect of all that would be that the risk was that the productive life of the Wairaki Tauhara geothermal system would have been shortened, perhaps by many years, had all the injection been required to go back into the field. And of course, well, if that was the case, then the whole economics, indeed, of the project would have been put into question. And similarly, if this bill had been passed and there was a 5-year limit on any future consents, what impact that would have on geothermal developments, we asked. And again, we got a pretty clear response that because each geothermal system is different and responds differently, then it's very difficult to, in the undeveloped systems of the Taupo volcanic zone, to have any great confidence that the elimination options to respond to the characteristics of particular systems would be able to be worked out within a 5-year period. So the net result of that would be that a 5-year grace period would be insufficient to enable an alternative to be developed to reduce discharges, which would lead so that a 5-year limit would effectively be a decline of a consent. Now, I go into this detail because I think it is very interesting, because I mean, what we saw here today was the New Zealand First, and for the first time since I've been in Parliament, I've found myself enjoying listening to one of Andrew Williams' speeches, and I thought he spoke very well on this topic. And New Zealand First were, quite strong in their conclusion that they could not support this bill because of the current regime was adequate, and B, they didn't want to be stopping development in this country. But the surprising thing is that Labour, the Labour Party, which you generally, well, certainly in the past was more sort of mainstream in their thinking about these things, seems to be chasing the Green Party further and further into the extremes of New Zealand politics in support of this bill. And so it's not surprising to me that Shane Jones has left. Why would you want to be an economic development minister in a coalition that doesn't believe in economic development? And so, and then you have this extraordinary contradiction in what they're talking about. So we hear a great deal about the Labour Party policies, for example, around power, and saying that they're very keen to reduce the cost of power. And yet here we have them red-handed supporting a bill which would quite clearly increase the cost of power generation and make it far more difficult to come up with renewable electricity in the geothermal space because they're wanting to follow everything that the Greens come up with. So I find that hard to reconcile, those two sorts of things. On the one hand, you're keen to have cheaper electricity, but here again is another example of being willing to pass all sorts of legislation and regulation which increases the cost of power, and they don't seem to see the contradiction in what they're saying there. Mr. Speaker, National does not support this bill. We stand strongly behind good environmental regulation for New Zealand, and the RMA is quite detailed in its law, and it balances the protection of the environment against with economic growth, and streamlining and simplifying the RMA is important. But the most important thing in regulation is that businesses which are looking to create opportunities for jobs and for economic growth in this country, upon which we all rely, have some measure of certainty and have some ability to cope with complex situations such as you face with the geothermal developments. And if politicians come in and pass laws which put a straitjacket around all potential development, and reduce that flexibility, then the consequence is obvious. It is going to be less investment, less jobs, more expensive electricity, more expensive and fewer options for New Zealand workers, and I don't support that in any way, shape or form. I would just finish by just reminding, however, that while that this government has made a huge amount of progress on water quality issues generally across the country through such initiatives as the Land and Water Forum and the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management in 2011. Yes, it takes a long time. These things don't happen overnight because there's a lot of talk, and the issues aren't easy to resolve. But at least we're making some progress, and beyond that, beyond our shores, I would like to, in the oceans sense, this is the party that brought in the EEZ legislation where there had been none, and again we received great lectures from the other side about oil and gas exploration. Well, when previous parties were in government, they had nothing in place when they were passing all sorts of exploration permits. So I think this government has a very strong record to stand on in terms of environmental legislation and the contribution that were made, but this bill, unfortunately, it wouldn't affect anything in the Tararua area for 22 years. It would affect potential investment in geothermal power, and we do not support it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is that you have to be quick. The members seeking a call?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member Sua William Seo. Malo sui fua.